You've seen people walk into a courtroom like they own it, confident, untouchable, protected by power. Over my decades on the bench, I have seen every variation of arrogance, but the morning Victoria Sterling clicked her designer heels past the wooden gates, she brought a new level of audacity into my domain. She wore a tailored suit that likely cost more than the average American's car, and she wore it with the distinct, dismissive energy of someone who believed the law was merely a suggestion for the lower classes. This was one of those cases where a young woman believed her last name would save her. Victoria was the sole heiress to Sterling Enterprises, a real estate empire that essentially owned half the commercial blocks in the city. When people like Victoria make a mistake, they usually write a check, make a phone call, and the problem vanishes. But what happened next in this room, no one expected. Not even her father, Richard Sterling, who sat in the gallery with his arms crossed, projecting an aura of absolute invincibility. The charges on the docket were clear and entirely devoid of the glamour she projected: reckless endangerment, destruction of private property, and verbal assault. The story was maddeningly simple: a minor fender bender in a grocery store parking lot. The other driver? Thomas Pendelton, a 72-year-old disabled veteran who relied on a modified sedan to get to his weekly medical appointments. When Thomas had stepped out of his vehicle to exchange insurance information, Victoria didn't offer an apology. She didn't offer her driver's license. Instead, she offered a tirade. She mocked his age, kicked the dent in his bumper to finish the job, and threw a handful of $100 bills at his chest, telling him to buy something nice for his pathetic junk heap. As I read the file, my jaw tightened. Victoria stood at the defense table, checking her manicure, completely oblivious to the fact that she was standing on the precipice of a brutal reality check. She thought her wealth was a shield. She was about to learn that in my courtroom, justice doesn't care who your father is. I looked down at her from the bench, letting the heavy silence stretch just long enough to make her highly paid attorney shift uncomfortably in his seat. Power was never meant to be a shield, and today, hers was going to fail. The courtroom was completely silent as I opened the folder containing the details of the collision. The facts of this case were not a matter of debate. They were a matter of public record, captured from 3 different angles by traffic and security cameras. The victim, Thomas Pendelton, sat in the second row of the gallery. He was a 72-year-old disabled veteran who had served his country with honor, a man whose quiet dignity stood in stark contrast to the circus unfolding at the defense table. Thomas relied on a specially modified sedan, the vehicle Victoria Sterling had referred to as a pathetic junk heap, just to make it to the VA hospital for his weekly medical treatments. That car was his lifeline. It represented his independence. The footage played on the monitor for the entire courtroom to witness. The video showed Thomas's sedan stopped completely at a red light. It had been stopped for a full 8 seconds. Then Victoria's imported sports car barreled into the frame, braking far too late. The impact was violent, sending Thomas's car lurching forward into the intersection. When the dust settled, what the cameras recorded next was what elevated this from a mere traffic accident to an astonishing display of cruelty. Victoria did not rush out to check if the elderly driver was injured. She did not reach for her phone to call for medical assistance. Instead, she stepped out of her vehicle, visibly annoyed that her afternoon schedule had been interrupted. The audio recording from a nearby security camera picked up her voice with crystal clarity. "Are you blind?" she screamed at the man she had just hit. When Thomas, visibly shaken and clutching his chest, managed to open his door, she didn't offer a hand. She offered an insult. She threw money at his chest like he was a nuisance, got back into her slightly dented car, and drove away before the police or paramedics ever arrived. Watching the footage, I looked over at Victoria. There was no flinching, no lowering of the eyes. She watched herself commit a hit and run on an elderly veteran with the same detached boredom one might have while watching a television commercial. Her attorney leaned in to whisper something to her, desperately trying to manage the optics of the disaster playing out on screen, but she simply waved him off. She still believed this was just a minor inconvenience, a transaction her father's checkbook would seamlessly erase. She had no idea that the ground she was standing on was about to completely give way. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, the kind of heavy, suffocating stillness that only descends when everyone in the room collectively realizes a line has been crossed. I turned my attention from the monitor back to the defense table, letting the weight of the video footage settle over the room. "Miss Sterling," I said, my voice cutting sharply through the quiet, "would you care to explain what this court just witnessed?" Before her highly paid attorney could interject to run damage control, Victoria let out an exasperated sigh, casually adjusting the collar of her designer jacket. "Your Honor, this is being completely blown out of proportion," she said, her tone dripping with boredom. "It was a minor scratch. My father's insurance company has already offered to cover the repair costs and then some. I even left the man cash at the scene. I frankly don't understand why we are wasting taxpayer money on this." I leaned forward, folding my hands on the bench. The audacity itself was not surprising to me, but the casual, almost clinical cruelty of her perspective was staggering. "You consider throwing crumpled bills at a distressed elderly veteran who is clutching his chest to be an acceptable resolution to a hit and run?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously level. "You believe that because your father's insurance can cut a check, your legal and moral obligations to another human being simply evaporate?" Her attorney, a seasoned corporate litigator, who was now sweating profusely despite the air-conditioned room, scrambled to his feet. "Your Honor, please. My client was simply running late for a crucial board meeting. It was a high-stress situation. Mr. Sterling is entirely prepared to offer a formal apology on her behalf." "Mr. Sterling is sitting in the gallery, Counselor," I interrupted, my tone leaving zero room for debate. I pointed directly at Victoria. "He is not the defendant. The woman who just watched herself verbally abuse a disabled senior citizen and drive away from an accident without an ounce of regret is the defendant." I locked eyes with Victoria, refusing to let her look away. "Miss Sterling, you are standing in a court of law. Your social calendar does not supersede the safety of the public." Victoria rolled her eyes, a genuine, unvarnished eye roll, directed squarely at the bench. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she scoffed, crossing her arms, "my family literally funded the new physical therapy wing of the VA hospital where he gets treated. We've done more for this city's veterans than anyone in this room." Your father's philanthropy," I stated, striking the gavel once, sharply, "does not buy you a license to treat human beings like roadkill. You are operating under the dangerous delusion that your wealth provides immunity. You are about to find out that it does not." Victoria's smirk faltered, but only for a fraction of a second. The insulation of extreme wealth is a stubborn material. It takes more than a stern reprimand from the bench to crack it. She glanced back at the gallery toward her father, Richard Sterling. He gave her a subtle, reassuring nod. That silent, fleeting exchange spoke volumes. It was the exact dynamic that had defined her entire 24 years on this earth. "Make a mess, and Daddy will clean it up." I opened the second folder on my desk, the one containing her driving history. "Let us talk about your record, Miss Sterling," I said, flipping through the meticulously documented pages. "In the past 3 years, you have accumulated 4 speeding tickets, all in excess of 20 miles over the posted limit, 2 citations for running red lights, and 1 previous charge of reckless driving that was magically reduced to a minor moving violation after your father's legal team overwhelmed the municipal court with paperwork." "Those were misunderstandings," Victoria interrupted, her voice gaining a sharp edge of irritation. "And my lawyers handled them perfectly legally. Everyone gets tickets, Your Honor. Everyone does not leave a 72-year-old man clutching his chest in a busy intersection," I fired back, my voice echoing off the heavy mahogany walls. "You have consistently treated the laws of this state as an a la carte menu, choosing to follow only the ones that do not inconvenience your schedule. And now, you have escalated from mere recklessness to a criminal hit and run." Her attorney stood up again, his face flushed, moving frantically to extinguish the fire his client was fueling. "Your Honor, I strongly object to this characterization. We are prepared to offer Mr. Pendelton a settlement of $50,000 today, right now in this room. That is more than enough to buy him a new car and cover any perceived distress. This does not need to proceed to a criminal sentencing." In the gallery, Thomas Pendelton lowered his head, staring silently at his weathered hands. The sheer indignity of having his trauma priced and negotiated like a used piece of furniture hung heavily in the air. $50,000, I repeated, letting the number hang in the silence. I looked at Victoria, who was now smiling again, her posture relaxing. She clearly believed the magic words had finally been spoken. The checkbook had been opened. The problem was solved. "Miss Sterling," I said softly, using the kind of quiet tone that precedes a devastating storm, "do you truly believe that writing a check absolves you of your basic human decency?" She sighed, checking her diamond-encrusted watch. "Honestly, Your Honor? Yes, that's what money is for. to fix things. Can we just wrap this up? I have a flight to Milan at 4 o'clock. Miss Sterling, I said, leaning forward. The air in the courtroom felt brittle, like glass about to shatter. Your flight to Milan is officially canceled. Victoria blinked, her perfect posture suddenly breaking as she looked at me in genuine disbelief. Behind her, I saw Richard Sterling sit up straight, the casual confidence draining from his posture. The attorney at her side opened his mouth, but the words died in his throat as I raised a single hand. Since you seem to believe that your wealth insulates you from the consequences of your actions, allow me to re-educate you on how the justice system actually functions, I stated, my voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. This was not a civil dispute over a damaged bumper. This was a hit-and-run involving an elderly disabled victim. You fled the scene of a collision. That is a criminal offense. I left my information, Victoria protested, her voice rising an octave, the polished veneer cracking. I left him cash. That's basically the same thing. You threw money at a man who was clutching his chest, insulted him, and drove away. I corrected her, my tone leaving zero room for interpretation. You did not call an ambulance. You did not exchange insurance documents. You prioritized your social calendar over human life. And judging by your horrific driving record, this is not an isolated incident. This is a pattern of catastrophic arrogance. I turned my attention to the gallery, looking directly at the man whose silent dignity had anchored the room. Mr. Pendelton, this court acknowledges the profound disrespect and trauma you endured. No amount of money thrown at you in a parking lot can erase the indignity of that encounter. Thomas nodded slowly, his eyes bright with a mixture of relief and vindication. I turned back to the defendant, who was now clutching the edge of the defense table, her knuckles white. Victoria Sterling, based on the undeniable video evidence and your staggering lack of remorse in this courtroom today, I find you guilty of leaving the scene of an accident involving property damage and personal injury. You can't do this, Victoria gasped, turning to her attorney. Tell her she can't do this. I assure you, Miss Sterling, I can, I replied coldly. And I am. The gavel coming down wasn't just a piece of wood striking a block. It sounded like the definitive end of an era. The impact of that sound rippled through the courtroom, and for the first time since she had walked through the doors, Victoria Sterling's carefully constructed facade shattered entirely. Bailiffs, I instructed, my voice unwavering, take the defendant into custody. As the officers moved toward her, the reality of the situation finally breached the fortress of her privilege. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking suddenly very young and entirely terrified. She spun around, her eyes wide, searching the gallery for the one man who had always been her safety net. Daddy, she cried out, her voice cracking as the bailiff gently but firmly grasped her arm. Daddy, please do something. Tell her. Fix this. The courtroom held its collective breath. All eyes turned to Richard Sterling, the billionaire real estate mogul, a man known for his ruthless business tactics and his ability to bend the city's power structures to his will, stood up slowly. He smoothed the front of his tailored suit, his face a mask of unreadable stoicism. Victoria reached her hand out toward him over the wooden railing, separating the gallery from the defense area. Daddy, please, she begged, the designer heels that had clicked so arrogantly earlier now scrambling uselessly against the linoleum floor. Richard Sterling looked at his daughter. He looked at the disabled veteran sitting quietly in the row ahead of him. And then he looked directly at me. What happened next is a moment that will stay etched in my memory and the memory of everyone present for the rest of our lives. He didn't pull out his phone to call his army of fixers. He didn't shout an objection. He simply looked at Victoria, his voice carrying the heavy, terrible weight of a father's profound disappointment. Victoria, he said, his words dropping into the silence like stones, you brought this on yourself. Then he sat back down. He didn't break eye contact with her as she was led away, her protest dissolving into panicked sobs. The click of her heels faded down the hallway, replaced by the heavy thud of the courtroom doors closing behind her. She had walked in believing her name made her untouchable. She was walking out in handcuffs, abandoned by the very power she thought would save her. As Victoria was escorted out, the heavy, imposing doors of the courtroom swinging shut behind her, the silence left in her wake was entirely different from the one that had preceded it. It was no longer a tense, expectant quiet. It was the quiet of profound resolution. A palpable sense of relief seemed to exhale from the gallery. I turned my attention back to the gallery, specifically to the second row. Mr. Pendelton, I said gently, ensuring my voice carried the respect he had been denied. The courtroom belongs to you for a moment, if you have anything you wish to say. Thomas Pendelton slowly stood up. He leaned heavily on his cane, his posture reflecting years of service and the inevitable toll of age. But his eyes were remarkably clear. The entire room remained perfectly still, hanging on whatever words this quiet, dignified man would choose to speak. Your Honor, Thomas began, his voice raspy but steady. I've seen a lot in my years. I've seen good men lose everything, and I've seen bad men walk away with more than they deserve. When that young woman hit my car and threw money at my feet, she didn't just damage my property. She tried to take my dignity. She looked at me and decided I didn't matter because I didn't have what she had. He paused, taking a slow breath, his grip tightening slightly on his cane. For the past 3 weeks, I've been asking myself if the country I fought for still believes in the same rules for everyone. If justice is just a word we use to keep the poor in line while the rich do as they please. He looked toward the defense table, now empty, and then back to me. Today, you answered that question for me. You showed me that decency isn't for sale, and that the law doesn't care how deep your pockets are. I didn't want her money. I wanted her to understand that other people are real. Thank you, Your Honor, for reminding me that my service wasn't for nothing. He sat down. The applause that started from the back of the gallery wasn't loud or raucous, but it was deeply felt. It was the sound of ordinary people recognizing that the system, despite its flaws, had worked. The days that followed Victoria Sterling's sentencing sent a profound shockwave through the city's upper echelons. For a brief window, the society pages and gossip columns were buzzing with absolute disbelief, completely unable to process the image of the untouchable heiress trading her tailored silk suits for a standard-issue county jail uniform. But the sensationalism quickly faded, replaced by the quiet, undeniable reality of the consequences she was finally forced to face. Her 60 days in standard custody were not served in a specialized VIP wing. They were served alongside everyday people whose lives had also derailed, though often with far less of a safety net to catch them. When she finally emerged from the facility, there were no waiting limousines or lavish welcome-back parties. Her driving privileges remained suspended for a full year, and the court's mandate required her to complete her 200 hours of community service at the very same VA hospital where Thomas Pendelton received his treatments. I was later informed by the hospital administrators that her first few weeks were a profound struggle. She was defiant, bitter, and completely out of her depth while pushing wheelchairs, emptying bedpans, and serving meals. But slowly, the impenetrable walls she had spent a lifetime building began to crack. Proximity to genuine human struggle has a unique, almost magical way of eroding unearned arrogance. As for Thomas Pendelton, he used the court-ordered restitution not just to replace his vehicle with a reliable, modified van, but to donate a substantial portion of the remaining funds to a local veterans' transportation charity. He remained the quiet, steadfast man he had always been, proving once and for all that true dignity cannot be bought, sold, or stolen by someone who simply has a larger bank account. Sometimes, a courtroom is just a bureaucratic room where paperwork is filed and minor fines are processed. But on its absolute best days, it is the ultimate equalizer in our society. It is the one room where the size of your portfolio shrinks in the shadow of the law. The next time you see someone abusing their power, or someone confidently hiding behind a famous name, remember the morning Victoria Sterling walked into my courtroom. She firmly believed her family's wealth made her untouchable, but she was forced to learn the hardest lesson of all. Power was never meant to be a shield, and character is the only thing that remains when that power finally fails.